Welcome to today's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and as always, this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome to the show this week Emily Kornheiser, regular contributor and representative from the town of Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Hello, Olga. Good to see you.
Good to see you too on this kind of gray, rainy morning.
Endless gray, raining morning.
And new to the show, John Woodward, who is an energy economist and policy consultant. So glad you can join us today, John.
It's nice to have you. Be had.
Well, what I'm excited about talking about today is, as folks may know, this summer, Emily, and probably into the fall, knowing us, we're going to spend some time looking at Vermont from a bigger perspective. And so today we're going to be touching into renewable energy and how that all fits with issues around the power grid. And I'm intrigued, John, going forward for this conversation because we always talk about how things are connected, especially when we talk about things like climate change. And you can't get much more of a web, I think, than the power grid, because it's connecting towns, it's connecting regions. And if you, as I understand it, if you pull on one piece of it, other pieces happen. And so when you fit renewable energy into the conversation, you start talking about policies and economics and governance and all these other things outside just what powers your light bulb when you turn on your light in the morning. So I'd love to start, John, let's give folks a lay of the land right now. How are the grid and renewables fitting together or not right now?
Sure. Yes, it is a very much a sticky web, too. Some people call the grid the world's biggest machine, which I think is pretty accurate, since it literally, you can connect, the plugs in our house to the plugs in someone's house in California, if you want to trace the lines. Well, almost, but another story. So, right now, say in Vermont, right, we have very strong, like a bunch of other states, very strong renewable electricity and renewable energy targets. On the books and statute, we're supposed to be aiming for 90% renewable energy by 2050, and a big chunk of that will be done through electricity, cleaning up and greening up the electricity supply, which is already starting out pretty green to begin with in Vermont, largely thanks to lots of hydropower, long-standing relationship with our Quebecois neighbors up north. Hydro-Quebec specifically, lots of big hydropower dams have been giving us some firm renewable power for a long time. But we, in addition to that, so those are sort of traditional, green renewable energy. But what grabs most of the attention, of course, is the wond that's come on the last 10, 20 years, and of course all the solar that's being deployed largely. Not exclusively, but largely through net metering policies. Right. This is the classic rooftop solar stuff that gets a lot of attention in the press. But we also have larger, what they call utility scale solar plants that are less visible and less the subject of sort of public policy debates, because it's utilities contracting with developers to build bigger plants that become part of our overall power supply portfolio. But so it's important to distinguish between what they call distributed renewable energy. That's renewable energy plants that are actually patched into the distribution grid, and the more traditional renewable sources that are patched into the transmission system or the bulk power system generate there and basically flow their power downstream to consumers. So distributed is still a new paradigm, distributed generation that we'll be sort of adapting to and coping with for a long time, because the implications are that we now are sending, if we have enough of it, we'll be sending power up onto the distribution grid. It will flow to where it is in demand in any given second, because of the speed that electricity moves to. But that has lots of implications for how basically utilities need to operate in order to avoid reliability problems on the grid, but also just in general to plan for that some level of penetration of renewable generation that could flow now where we're have two-way power flows, where the grid was not at all designed with that in mind. This is in a lot of ways.
Can I clarify or ask a clarifying
So we
question?
should probably just preface all of this with saying you can get pretty technical pretty fast, and acronyms can go undefined. I'm just used to talking that way, so I'll try my best, but hold me accountable.
Before you jump in, Emily, sorry, I just want to check you mentioned two-way power flows. Does that mean we would have energy that was trying to flow in and out of the system at the same time?
Yeah, so an example. Right now, Windham County, we're all in. There's a distribution utility owned substation called the North Brattleboro substation. You might have seen the construction work they did on it last summer. There will be on really sunny days, there's enough solar in the surrounding area. There will be power flowing from those solar panels up into the substation and onto the bigger wires that are normally fed to that, where power is normally fed to that substation, is now exporting from that substation onto the larger distribution system. So from there, it goes, just by the laws of physics, it will go to where the nearest load center is, wherever that is. So it can also go even further onto the transmission system, which is run and owned by VELCO, Vermont Electric Power Company, and is part of a larger regional bulk power system that has a sort of different set of governance structures and rules, is subject to regulation from the federal government, Federal Energy Regulatory Committee, and other entities, but it's considered the wholesale system. So we are inching towards a place where these two-way power flows are actually blurring some of the jurisdictional lines that we're used to operating with, because the distribution system is pretty much predominantly the domain of state regulators. I used to work for the Public Service Department, and that is the system that they are charged with overseeing, and the companies and other players that operate or patch onto that system are all the purview of the state. But now that roster includes like lots of net metering customers, lots of other solar developers, battery owners and operators now, what we call aggregators, people who come in and third parties who come in and collect a bunch of customer loads, sort of package them into a quote unquote dispatchable resource where you can sort of shut demand on and off at critical times. Anyways, this whole roster of players now,
They're all
growing.
starting to overlap and bump into each other. Okay.
Yes.
And then it
Thank
becomes
you.
the purview of regional jurisdiction. But before we get to that, I just want to say, going back to the hydropower Quebec issue, just if listeners want to learn more about hydropower Quebec, because it is green and there's some really significant cultural and environmental destruction that has happened as a result of those dams. And if folks want to learn more about that, NHPR did an incredible little mini series on hydropower Quebec and the history of some of the conflicts there and how they related to really sort of the history of that region of Canada, battles between the French and the English and the Indigenous folks. It's a really fascinating series. And so want folks, if they want to learn more about that, I highly recommend that other podcast.
I will see if I can link to it in the show notes.
That would be great. Do you remember what it was called, John?
Outside In. It was a very good series. It might have been their first sort of premiere, and then they just kept going after that, like all podcasts do.
And then the other thing that I just sort of wanted to clarify for myself is what I heard you say is that sort of historically you have folks who produce the energy, companies that produce the energy and sort of feed it to the companies that purchase the energy, who then sell it to customers. And what you're saying is that on some level, the distributed energy is a reversal of that existing pattern, and that brings up governance issues. Is that too much of a summary of a complicated issue?
It's pretty close. Okay. It might be good enough. You know, I think the sort of boiled down way to say it is that we're having to navigate our way through what was a central station paradigm, that is, build big generating stations, site them wherever, you know, because they use, unless they're, you know, a big hydropower plant or you know, you can more or less, they're using fuel, you know, commodity fuel, fossil fuel, you can more or less site them wherever, but they patch into the transmission system, so very big poles and wires that are part of a system that's designed to distribute that central station power to distribution systems like the ones that we think of when we see telephone poles, which are originally power poles. But and so moving from that paradigm to one where now we have distributed plants that are also putting power onto the system that is being consumed locally. The details around how it's paid for, I mean, you raised that element, which is obviously, you know, a big part of it.
Let's not do that part yet.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. And so, and then so from there, and then that's sort of the flows, historic flows, new flows. And then there's the governance, which historically has, well, not, we don't want to go too far back in history because, well, we will, but that's not what I'm asking about right now. So right now, governance, especially in Vermont, you said that it was regulated at the state level for distribution within the state, sort of to customers. And that's a patchwork in Vermont of private sector corporations, and then co-ops. And then from there, it's governed regionally by the ISO, which is federally regulated. Can you get a little bit more into that?
Yes. So at the regional level, so what I was calling the wholesale system, it is overseen by the Federal Energy Regulatory Committee at an abstract level. I mean, and like historically, you know, that is what the FERC, we call it, was instituted to do. Interestingly, because, you know, we're talking about interstate trade when we talk about power flowing across state borders. And they, in the late, when was it, early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, instituted a requirement for regional transmission organizations to be developed, which is another way to say basically ISO, independent system operator, which you're talking about. So these entities were given the responsibility that the nonprofits, they're given a responsibility of doing several things. The main one is basically, well, they're overlapping, so I shouldn't say main one, but they're planning the build out of the transmission grid. So they are organizing all the stakeholders that need to be part of a discussion about how many more of these big poles and wires we need to build in order to reliably serve what we expect to be future load. But they also organize and administer a wholesale market. That's literally a giant auction that clears every 5 minutes, and all the generators that are those central station type generators that I mentioned before, they will make bids, dollar value bids into the auction, and the ISO will take those bids and arrange them from lowest to highest and figure out what's called the quote unquote merit order, and come up with a dispatch schedule so that their daily operations, they can basically run the grid, call on these plants in real time when needed based on their financial willingness to generate power at at the price points they offered.
And the ISO that we operate under in Vermont is ISO New England. What are the scale of other ISOs around the country?
So
are they usually like 5 states or whatever we are?
Yeah, we are 5 states. I mean, it is, before talking, well, okay, I'll go through them and then come back to Vermont. So ISO New England is, how does it compare? I don't know. It's not one of the bigger ones, actually. New York has its own ISO, so it is its own transmission planning area. There's PJM, which originally stood for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland, but has since expanded to cover most of the mid-Atlantic and a good chunk of the eastern part of the Midwest, including like areas of Ohio. There's the California ISO, its own entity, and
Texas famously has its own, right?
Yeah, Texas has its own. ERCOT, people probably know that acronym by now. Electric Reliability Council of Texas. It's in fact its own, to add another term here. It's its own interconnection area. Okay. But there's a lot of areas of the country, probably close to the majority, don't quote me on this, so let's say around half or more of the actual territory of USA that is not part of a organized market the way I explained it. So they have other ways of dealing with sort of daily dispatching and even other ways of planning the transmission system. Similar, but not the same. In Vermont, it just real quick is worth mentioning that we are the only state within ISO New England that maintains what is called a vertically integrated industry structure, which, long story short, means our utilities are still allowed to own generation. That in the late 90s, around the same time that the FERC was sort of pushing these orders that said go forth and basically administer wholesale markets, a lot of states were also doing what's called restructuring or deregulation, depending on how you think about it. Which basically meant that utilities had to mostly divest themselves of the generation that they owned previously. So all those plants, those big central plants that they owned, they were no longer allowed to own under the hope and dream that you could introduce competition within the generation segment of the industry, so that now, we can have all these merchant plants competing in a market, on price, making literally bids into an administered auction, and that would get us the lowest possible wholesale price of power that would then flow down to the distribution companies, which are now, except for in Vermont, wires only companies. They just own the wires and make sure that the small poles and wires at the distribution level are maintained and their customers are happy, but they don't run power plants anymore. Not so in Vermont. We still have a fair amount. In fact, Emily and I are going to the Waterbury State Park and on Monday, where the GMP still owns a hydropower plant that has been ponded up into a reservoir. So it's from the 1930s, I think.
Oh, cool.
So, and two things. One, we did not reveal that John is my partner here on the show yet.
In interest of full disclosure.
In interest of full disclosure, we were going to record in the same room and then decided that not to. And so we are in two different rooms of the same house. And I'm really excited to have John on the show today and talk about electricity.
Was that not supposed to say that? Was that blowing?
No. It was good. It was good.
Yeah,
I meant to do it at the beginning.
Good. Yeah.
And
that's the proper thing to do.
Yes. As a family, we do occasionally vacation near historic electrical infrastructure because that's how cool we are. And then one thing that's really interesting to me about the Vermont grid in relationship to all of this other stuff, and part of why I wanted to talk about all this today, is that given that so much of our electricity governance and purchasing happens in the context of the ISO New England, not in the context of just Vermont, it's helpful for me to remember what an incredibly small scale Vermont's electricity needs and market is in relationship to ISO New England. And while we have a different regulatory structure that I think is important to talk about, I also, I think often we talk about the solutions for climate change or the future of Vermont in this context of let's electrify everything and then it will be green. But it's only green if the grid is green. And us greening our Vermont grid is often small potatoes, tiny beans, whatever you want to call it, in relationship to the scale of the ISO grid that we have. So I'm curious to hear about sort of what scale we are in relationship to the ISO grid and how much power Vermont has in relationship to these other states that are purchasing and producing so much more than we are.
Yeah, we're a drop in the bucket. Roughly 4% of the electrical energy consumed, more or less same number of customers in the region.
4% of the New England grid is consumed in Vermont.
4% of all electrical load consumed in New England is consumed by Vermonters. So, however, there are sort of, I will get to the question of like whether or not that means our power portfolio is actually green or not. I think you can still, just as a preview, safely say it is, at least on a contractual basis. But the way the ISO New England governance structure is set up allows for fairly equal participation of each of the 6 New England states in the various transmission planning discussions and processes, as well as like policy conversations, which the latter of are having to happen more and more because of all the problems posed by the fact that the wholesale market was not designed for renewable generators that don't have fuel costs. Interesting thing, rabbit hole we could go down another time. But that's not like, I think you're getting at more the sort of purchasing power that maybe Vermont had, the influence that might be wielded by, the dollars that utilities and customers spend on power, thereby, like, to the extent that those are sort of demand signals for generators, and like, do they move the needle? And so, it'd be one thing if we were just like getting all of our power, off the wholesale market, and like just, whatever the whatever power cleared through the market, that's what we're getting, and be predominantly natural gas. That's been the story for the past 10 years, the vast expansion of natural gas. But we actually have a lot of, we do, like I said, we still own some of our own generation, so that's self-supply. It's not actually a lot, and that fleet really hasn't been added to, except for the wind, some of the wind, the wind plants in the Northeast Kingdom and around there, much ballyhooed wind. So it's, and solar, of course. But other than that, there are a lot of actual bilateral, one party to one party contracts that the utilities have signed with other generators that entitle them to power from specific generation sources. So these are ways to not have to be reliant on market power, spot purchases, they're called, on the market. They're locked in contracts. Some of them are pretty long term, to the extent that, like, I think for the next 10 to 15 years, it's been a while. I don't look at this stuff anymore. I'm not a regulator anymore, but we have a pretty much a really pretty green portfolio of contract path power.
So does that mean that our power company, say, either the Central Vermont Power Co-op or Green Mountain Power, have relationships to buy directly from electricity producers, and so they're not going through that auction process that you described?
Yeah, you could think of it that way. So every auction has to have two sides, buyer and seller. Everything that the utilities have to serve as load has to actually be cleared has to be paid for at the clearing price of the auction. But the various prices that are being paid in these contracts are whatever they are negotiated with the other party. So if it's a big nuke plant, that's going to give 24/7 firm power, that's going to have one price. If it's a wind plant, New Hampshire, that's probably that's just going to be able to guarantee a little bit, not base load power, not all the time. It's going to be a different price. So there's entire divisions of the utilities that their job is to make sure that they have what they consider a good portfolio, a good hedged portfolio, and has to pass muster with the regulators as least costs. So in terms of the power they're buying from suppliers, that's going to be the sum product of all those different contracts, plus whatever they're exposed to day to day, minute to minute, to fill the gap that they don't have locked in on the market.
So one thing I want to talk about after the break is how those power purchases influence the cost to consumers, and particularly something that we've talked about, how essentially solar is subsidized by the consumer and what that looks like from an equity perspective. But I don't, Olga, do you have other?
I think, yeah, we do have to go to break to hear from some of our underwriters. But what I'm sitting with right now too is I loved what you said about how solar is subsidized. I think we should dig into that. But what I'm sitting with is that 4% of consumption, and how we have these big goals for climate change, and just exactly how much, not that we shouldn't go forward with them, but how much power does Vermont have to make a dent in climate change, is something I'm just really sitting with right now too. So we're going to go to break. We're going to hear from some of our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us at our website, which is the Montpelier Happy Hour at captivate.fm, Emily's YouTube channel, as well as BCTV and Apple Podcasts. Hey, Emily, what do we have to remind listeners of?
Well, Olga, the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, and none of the platforms, broadcast stations, websites, or employers of any of the hosts and the guests. Just the hosts and the guests' views and opinions. Thank you.
It's just a little capsule of time, a little moment of conversation that exists on its own.
And then is saved forever in posterity.
Yeah.
The internet. Yes.
You can dip back into it whenever you want. We save moments. Right before the break, we started talking about solar a little bit, Emily, and you brought up some questions about costs and equity and how that system around solar works. Would you dive back into that, please?
Yeah. So I want a green future. I do not want to die in a fiery explosion. I don't want, drought and flood and all of the things that are clearly on the horizon with climate change. I want to create a good future for my child, all of those things. And I remain and continue to be concerned about so many of our solutions. Our green solutions are often market-based. And those market-based solutions, I think, very often benefit those who can afford them, financially even. There are incentives that are built in that only folks who can afford them can afford. While the impacts of climate change are going to hit poor folks and folks of color, marginalized folks of any kind first. And we talked 2 weeks, some point recently, with Abby Corse, who is on the Climate Council. And she also expressed some of these same concerns about what a just transition looks like. And so I want to sort of step back into how we set electricity prices and sort of what progressive electricity prices looks like and how solar and net metering fits into all of that. Because if we're going to do this well, I think we really need to be mindful and understand how the levers impact each other. And I think it's, well, as people could tell from the beginning of this segment, it's really complicated. And sometimes it's worth understanding the complication so that we can find solutions that actually get us where we want to go instead of somewhere else.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of ways in which, all of the developments that are being sort of heralded as like, awesome tech innovations at the grid edge and like all these companies that are spinning out and offering customer facing services, energy services, whether or not, the dashboard for usage or smart appliances that can, communicate with the cloud and turn off and on demand and all this stuff. Plus, storage, residential scale storage in your basement and rooftop solar, all that stuff. Like they really challenge sort of the core of the social compact that has been sort of established between the state and the utility companies, which is a guarantee, a monopoly in exchange for a guarantee of universal, reliable service at, quote unquote, just and reasonable costs. I think, peering into, the controversies around net metering policies really provides a case in point. It's not the only one, of course, but it is definitely one that people argue about a lot, and one where sort of, the developers of solar projects that qualify for net metering treatment really have been lining up against kind of the ratepayer advocates, whether or not it's the regulator.
Can you back up and explain to us what net metering is?
Yeah.
And then try to describe what the experience of net metering is to the average customer who's not a net metering customer.
Right. So net metering is actually kind of an accidental policy that has turned into its own universe, really. So the basic premise is that you can throw some solar panels up onto your roof or onto your yard, and when those solar panels produce power, they will cause your utility meter that they read for billing purposes, the utility does, to run backwards, and basically you can zero out your bill if you have enough power. If anyone's watching this and is savvy to the particulars of how this is actually done, the technical particulars in Vermont today, they will tell me, of course, it's generally we have production meters, 2 different meters, one for the plant and one for the house, and blah blah blah. It doesn't matter. The upshot is that you can basically get rid of your bill. So you partner with a developer, the way it tends to work, of which there are several in Vermont, but it is an increasingly consolidated field, such are the patterns of capitalism. And so you partner with a developer to, pay them something to get the things on your roof or in your yard, and that basically replaces your bill. And it's, if the price points are low enough for solar, then you'll actually be paying less right out of the gate. Or if they offer you a lease or a loan payment instead of, paying all up front, which has been a pretty big way that developers have sort of increased their sales volumes and their customer basis for these projects. You have to make it so that they don't have to actually front all the cash, of course, but you can probably already detect that there's obvious market segmentation that anyone who's a developer in this business line would think would want to develop their business model around, that being people who can afford it versus people who don't. You don't go knocking on people's doors who don't afford it, can't afford it.
John, for local listeners, want to give them some context. I believe the town of Brattleboro has a net metering contract, as do some of the schools have some net metering contracts with larger solar fields in the area. And I think there's another one up in Putney as well was developed for net metering. So it is something we have locally.
Well, and also
people are using.
I mean, anyone our next door neighbor has a solar panel in his yard, and that's a net metering contract. And most people, if you drive past their house and they have solar panels, newer solar panels, they have a net metering contract. When I first met a solar panel, which is, I think, like the first year I moved to Vermont and I like went out to visit someone who was living, you know, off the grid with a solar panel. That's not a net metering contract. They have like a closed loop, but very few people do that anymore. Most people are adding it to their existing operation. And that's, so individuals have net metering contracts too. And any sort of solar panel you drive past is usually that.
Yeah, it's a huge program in Vermont. In fact, per capita, you know, we're up there very close to the top, if not the top, in terms of the installed solar capacity, small scale distributed solar capacity per capita, like up there with Hawaii and California. So as you know, normalized to our population and our load, it's a lot, and net metering is a big chunk of that. You say these are not off-grid systems; they're grid-connected systems. And sort of to understand how this has impacted kind of the way that different socioeconomic, classes pick up the tab for different, costs of the system. You have to understand how we did that how we do rate design and how we did that cost recovery before net metering was really even a twinkle in anyone's eye. And the simple way to understand that is that I think we have a two-part, generally the practice is, and this is not unique to Vermont, this is pretty standard. For residential customers especially, we have a two-part tariff. So why utility rates that are charged to the consumer are called tariffs, I don't know, but we call them tariffs. A two-part tariff system, which is one, relatively small fixed charge, a set amount on your bill that will hit you every month. Generally, it's supposed to capture like the cost of your installing your meter and your service drop and some other pretty marginal costs. And there's a whole bunch of other fixed costs of the distribution systems. Fixed costs, they have to be incurred. You have to build poles and wires and substations, and that cost has to be recovered. There's a whole bunch of other ones that just aren't in that fixed cost, that customer charge, that fixed. The other part of the tariff is what we all think of when we think of the rate. It's the charge per kilowatt hour. But all those other costs, for the other fixed costs for poles, wires, transformers, et cetera, are also being recovered through that per kilowatt hour charge, a good chunk of them. So what that means is when you reduce your usage, you're reducing the amount of kilowatt hours you consume, whether or not that's through a better efficiency, turning off your lights more often, or through a net metered project in your backyard that's reducing your apparent build usage. You're actually now leaving a whole bunch of fixed costs stranded, and at least that you would have otherwise helped the utility to cover. Now they have to be recovered somewhere else. And that tends to show up if you don't change the structure of the tariff, it tends to show up in rate increases for the general residential rate class or general customers in the future. So there's a cost shift happening.
Can I just try to, so if we have less people who, because they have solar panels or because they're just reducing their power usage, we have sort of a less number of total net metered hours, that the fixed cost can be distributed across. And so the cost per kilowatt hour needs to go up because we have a smaller pool of people who are paying those costs now.
Right. And there's been some efforts in other states, but also in Vermont, to the net metering rules for how much they get compensated change now by statute every 2 years. The Public Utility Commission has to revisit them and basically tweak them, generally tweak them lower because of this issue is the expectation anyways. But one of those changes was also to make sure that there's a charge for net metering customers that they cannot bypass. That it's supposed to represent some chunk of that fixed cost that they're otherwise avoiding paying.
And from a policy perspective, this, as a legislator, this becomes incredibly difficult because we have very different things that we want to incentivize, right? Like we want to incentivize the creation of more renewable energy, and we want, from a very sort of simplistic outside perspective, we want it to look like we're incentivizing the creation of more solar. Like that should be a very transparent incentive for folks. And we don't want the entire burden, and we want people to reduce their electricity usage, right? Like we want people to use efficiency. We have an entire agency that is devoted towards this, Efficiency Vermont, that we pay for dearly. And then at the same time, we don't want to create a system where the burdens of all of that, or the burdens of the grid, are sitting with fewer and fewer people who are less and less likely to afford it. And so figuring out how to navigate those three dynamics and sort of the competitions between them it's really confusing.
And I'm curious, Emily, given that the grid is something, and the policies that govern the grid are also that extend beyond Vermont, how much power does the legislature have in some respects to enact new policies or address some of these cross purposes?
Well, I think in some ways take more power than we have. And sometimes, and I think John and I would probably disagree about that in some ways. And sometimes I get a little bit of a, you in that legislature.
Oh dear.
So I guess I'd be more curious to hear how John would answer that question.
Well, so, the statutes that pertain to, regulated energy industries in Vermont, like in other states, do tend to leave a lot of the implementation details to rulemaking by the Public Utility Commission. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's a problem. People have different opinions on how prescriptive, obviously, legislation should, the language of legislation should be, but and
we've had the healthcare advocate on to talk about the Green Mountain Care Board. That was really hard for me to come up with for a second. And what sort of rulemaking and rate making process looks like there, and where opportunities for leverage are in that conversation. And so I'd be curious to hear from you as that rulemaking happens with the Utility Commission, where opportunities, who is at that table, how accessible is that process, who's actually paying any attention to what they're doing. I'll transparently say I pay no attention to what they're doing. And so be like, if you could share that with us a little bit, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, do we want to go back to solar at all? For a second, I felt like there was a loose end there, but should I try to close that before getting to this?
Sure, go ahead.
Whatever you want.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Yes, go for it.
Just kidding. So I think if you go back to that idea that like the core of the social compact with the utilities and the state is a guarantee of universal, affordable electrical service, and you then sort of add to the reality that, or the possibility that, a part of that service could well be, the ability to generate your own power, or to use locally generated power from your neighbor, or if that's somehow makes its way into the concept of what it means to provide local, distribution electrical service, distribution system level, then that really shifts how you would go about things how you would make policies that incentivize people to put up more solar panels, from one that is currently, fairly adversarial between developers and utilities. They get along fine, but they're having to be utilities are having to be reactive. They didn't plan for this reality, and also possibly away from, an approach that essentially is relying on the profit motive of developers in order to deploy the actual hardware and generating capacity, all of which depends on a way of allocating costs that leads to more and more of that fixed cost part of the equation being picked up by people who are at least likely to be able to afford solar plants. So this would be for any insiders in the regulatory scene, this would be a fairly radical reconception of what it means to guarantee universal service, because these are it is so rooftop solar is not considered essential to electrical service, because as I talked about, we've defined electrical service from a central power station paradigm. But if you did, just spitballing really, it'd be much easier to sort of think about utility programs that take on a lot of the development tasks, or utility programs that guarantee customers can install their own solar, that basically provide maybe on-bill financing to do that, or in some way or another use the utilities borrowing power for the capital costs. But essentially that anyone could come to the utility as a clearinghouse, and the utility would have the partnerships with developers in order to make these things happen. And the utility could plan around it instead of be reactive to it. Any customer, regardless of income, could approach the utility. Just concepts like that. There are sort of ways around the the paradigm of using sort of crude price incentives like net metering rates to sort of spurn developers to pick all of the lowest hanging fruit, which usually means richest folks, and start from there, and whatever costs are shifted onto other folks in the process, cost of progress, whatever. So there are ways around that.
What I hear you saying very simply is that we have these very clear guarantees that the Public Utility Commission makes all of its decisions around. And then we have policy goals that are not necessarily aligned with those guarantees. And what it makes me think of, and that maybe if we sort of built out that guarantee a little more broadly, it would be easier to align those goals. But what it reminds me of is there's so many places in state government where we've decided that we should have closed financial loops, fee structures that need to pay for that department exclusively. And because of that, we wind up underfunding whatever that regulatory body is, or underfunding that system, because we create these wild sort of reverse incentives in there. And that those closed loops really don't leave space for the kind of policy progress that we often want to make.
Yeah.
Interesting.
There's actually, so this issue of like cost shifts has really risen much more to the public eye, or at least the public policy eye in California than here, although we talk about it a good deal. And it's a part of proceedings and all that. And there has been a really interesting proposal that's come from a pretty prominent like energy economist out there, UC Berkeley, to basically, it sounds so basic, but you would not believe how radical a notion it is. It's just to say, hey, why don't we raise some of these fixed costs that are sort of being poorly recovered and falling pretty heavy on lower income folks from the progressive income tax? Why don't we not raise all of the funds that we need to run the distribution system through rates that are sort of poorly designed? I mean, and like, I don't know where that is as a proposal, but it's such a sacred cow to like even say that. Like, from my time in government, like the idea that you could, dip into the general fund for the distribution system. I mean, there's reasonable trepidation around that. You don't, it could be, especially if we're talking about private utilities, investor-owned utilities, that like, we're talking about giving them a profit out of the general fund, and possibly talking about that, the potential for that, and the political stickiness issues. But it's the kind of creative thinking that like seems often off limits.
Thank you, John. I just looked at the time. I was so engrossed in the conversation that we have just a couple minutes left. And so just quickly touching base, we covered a lot of ground. Emily, John, any last thoughts any threads you want to just kind of tie a bow on before we end today's show?
Yeah. I just want to tie a bow really quick on the idea that I think often, being on the Committee on Ways and Means, I struggle to translate how tax and financing policy in government is directly linked to policy goals. And I think this is a really clear example for listeners about how much the way we structure the financing of government can often be at odds with our policy goals, or very closely aligned with our policy goals, and how being mindful of that on a really macro level is essential for us to provide good services to Vermonters. Thank you.
How about you, John?
Yeah, I wish it was possible to tie neat bows around all this stuff, but the grid is, I mean, there are so many open questions about how the grid at all levels, distribution, that's the retail level, transmission, wholesale level that we've talked about both in turn, how all of those levels are going to be run, and like what it really means to have 100% renewable grid, and like what that means for how utilities need to operate, what that means for consumers, whether or not they're going to be participants in the literal operations of the grid, minute to minute, if they have solar panels or batteries or, responsive loads in their home. How all that shakes out is I mean, we can go a long way greening up our power supply with, the way we have been in the past, and like the other states in the region and then the country doing similarly before having to figure all that out. But at some point, the locus of control of grid operations is really changing. It's going to have to be formally reflected in new laws and new rules and in new new codes of conduct and governance structures. If we're, when that happens, we don't know, but like being ready for that conversation is, and really bringing a strong sort of equity lens to it and public good lens to it will be really important, because there are very large forces of capital accumulation at play, and if we don't have a strong and updated sense of what the public interest means as all this happens, the path of least resistance might be to give away the farm to Google to control all the home automated devices or something. These are all
way to close with the apocalypse, John.
There you go.
Well, aren't we due?
Yeah, absolutely,
we do. Well, I want to thank you, John Woodward, energy economist and policy consultant, for being on the show today. And we always like to end with a toast. So I want to toast to keeping the public interest front and foremost in our minds when we are moving forward with system changes. So
nice one.
Here.
Here's that.
Thank you for joining us today, everybody. We will be back next week with another show. In the meantime, as I mentioned, you can find us at our website, at our Facebook page, at Emily's YouTube channel, and BCTV, WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro. And did I miss anyone, Emily?
I don't know. It's getting sillier and sillier. The list.
Well, in the meantime, everyone, have a great weekend. Take care.